Behind the Shades.
A girl I used to date many years ago, since you mentioned up the texting and the calling, she I can't even remember how many times, but she called and texted so many times that I called my service provider at that time. And I said, hey, what are my options here? Because I'm getting these calls from this number. And it was a young lady on the other end. And she's like, is someone stalking you? Someone harassing you? And I kind of like chuckled, right? Because I guess they're so used to it, like the phone companies. And she kind of chuckles, I kind of chuckle, and then it just made me feel better because when you actually think about it, it is kind of ridiculous that like as adults that we would actually behave that way. But I think sometimes, as you mentioned, like when you put on the therapist coach hat, it's like it drives you crazy when you're receiving it because you feel, at least for me, I felt like it was such an invasion of my life. Like here I am, I'm about to call, let's say Alea or text Alea, and I go to my phone and that number pops up again. And it's one of those things where it's like you want to put in your phone, like when you change the name to don't answer, she's crazy. It's like one of those things. And it's interesting that you mentioned that. So from the legal standpoint, it's in the best interest to leave it if you can, because you can use it as evidence further. Is that my understanding?
Sure, yes, because it's a record, and the courts do use text messages and call logs as a record for harassment. So whether it's a co-parenting issue or a domestic violence issue, if you're sending too many messages in a row without a response, that doesn't that isn't requiring of a response. There's always the caveats, right? Like if you're messaging the co-parent about like something that's going on with the kiddo and it's urgent, right? A number of messages would be appropriate. But in a case where someone hasn't messaged you back in 3 or 4 days and you're getting 15 to 20 messages, or what we see usually more, in a short time span over like a week or so, and there's been no response, or maybe there's been a polite response, please don't message me anymore, thank you. The courts will take that into consideration, or as harassment, or potentially keeping someone under surveillance, trying to find out where they are, seeking a response, or especially if the messages themselves are threatening. Like, why won't you answer me? If you don't answer, I'm going to come to your house, or you better answer, or ones that are maybe more direct on what a threat might look like. But just the sheer number of text messages could be considered harassment or disturbing one's mental peace as well.
Alea, where were you about 2.5 years ago when I
And it
had
sounds
people
like
saying, right?
like
I had people telling me they're going to show up to my house. Where were you?
Yeah, it sounds like your mental peace was disturbed once or twice. And I imagine some of your listeners may not be aware that that is emotional harassment, and it is harassment. And a court of law could look at that and, depending on how extreme the messaging is, take that into consideration when they may give someone a restraining order. So it is, I think, good to be mindful of, especially for ourselves, right? Because in an emotional state, we can all, even the best of us, can be put in a place where we might think sending a few messages back to back, feels right. And like we're letting out our emotions and we're being honest. And I think, a lot of times we hear in the media, or, even in therapy, like, it's good to write a letter or like get that cathartic, experience out. But it's good to be mindful of, because you don't want necessarily to be perceived in a way where you're also being like threatening or harassing. And I think the bar is moving a lot, and you don't necessarily always know where that bar is, and to kind of really be mindful about anything you put down in email or in text message, because the court system like will and can like use it as evidence. And, you may think that you're just showing someone how much you love them, and they may not be interpreting that information in that same way. Like it might be received in a different way. And I think that, it's good for everyone to be aware of, like whether you're a victim of that experience and you don't want to be a victim or a survivor of that any longer, as well as like you don't want to be the perpetrator, even if it's like well-intentioned, right? Even like to coworkers, this is not even in, romantic relationships, coworkers, family, friends can all be put off by messages that we think are well-intended and maybe lengthy. And so I think it's just good to be like considerate of that, because certainly I'm thinking of like workplace scenarios, like where if someone's getting too many messages, even from a coworker, they may feel that that's intrusive or invasive, and you don't know where somebody's boundaries are.
I'm glad you clarified that, because I always found it difficult to establish that boundary when it came to harassment, because what is harassment to me may not be harassment to you, and what's harassment to us may not necessarily be harassment to the court of law, for example, right? And I think sometimes, because when you go by the hard definition in the dictionary, it's something that like that happens 2 or more times. So for example, if I say that Jane down the street is pretty, I'm not harassing her. If I just say it once and she's like, oh, thank you, Trent, but I don't appreciate that, and I stop. Whereas some people now, it's a little bit different. It's not necessarily the action. I think sometimes it's, okay, how does it, I interpret it this way without the clarification, because you don't really know anyone's intention until you may ask them or you get inside their head, right? And you also made a good point where you want to make sure that you can demonstrate that it actually is harassment, meaning that the endless text messages or emails from a coworker at work, or someone is always in your space, even though you've let them know. How much of the burden of identifying the harassment piece is on the person who's experiencing it?
So the burden, at least in the family law court in California, is on the person filing for, like, say, a domestic violence restraining order. So if I was being harassed, right, I would have to prove to the judge that I was being harassed, right? Which is why I would need all those text messages and phone logs. It wouldn't be on them to prove that they were innocent by them providing their phone logs or their text messages. So it would be on my end, right, to prove that. However, that's like why like the record keeping is important. And I think that's where the law and the psychology are kind of in conflict, because, most therapists, I think, would say, like, block this person, like make sure they don't have access to you, like, keep that peace of mind for yourself. But then if you're the person having to prove that the abuse is occurring and you don't have any proof, you're just like, well, they were messaging me or they were calling me, but then I blocked them, then your proof has kind of dissipated. And I think that does put the person, if you will, like the person surviving that abuse, in a really challenging and emotional place. Because how can they prove without the evidence, but then how also do they protect themselves emotionally, which is like what you and I are here for, right? Like, how do we help someone be their best selves and then also still say, like, yes, keep incurring the abuse, like keep, just look at how many times they're texting you and try not to read it, but how is that, possible when you're receiving like threatening messages, and in the family law court, it's very different than the criminal court, right? So if you're guilty, you get a chance, you're innocent until proven guilty, but in the criminal court, there's an investigator going and trying to assist one in proving that. In the family law court, you're having to prove that this is occurring without the assistance of a professional. So I do think it puts people in a bind. And I imagine this is the same like in workplace violence, and probably even in non-romantic relationships, even friendships that, go south, or, in the instance of coworkers, just even if it seems innocent. And I think, we were kind of talking about like definitions, like the definition for me of what feels intrusive, invasive, or like someone stepping over my boundary, like may be very different for you. And certainly that's always in context of, race, religion, ethnicity, LGBTQ issues, like, and who you are as a person, how you were raised. I mean, just really everyone has their own cultural context of what feels intrusive. And I think we are entering into an interesting space in our culture, especially, and I say this in a lot of times, like with social media, there's a lot more access to a person or to whom you think the person may be, right? The social media version of me is not who I am if we were to go to dinner, because that's just, social media is not reality. Some people may put a lot on social media, but that doesn't mean that's the true nature of who that person is.